During the Civil War, with the Yankee soldiers coming into the southern towns, some of the enslaved took it upon themselves to use this as an opportunity to resist and rebel. With the Yankees being present, the owners could no longer control the Negroes as they had once done before, and the Negroes knew this. Now, just how different did the Negroes act during this time? We're about to find out. Let's go into Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, to see what former masters and mistresses had to say about this described out-of-control behavior. Here we go with. The terms with which slave-owning families described the conduct of their blacks, insolence, impertinence, impudence, and ingratitude, had been used often and indiscriminately to denote slave transgressions or departures from expected behavior when drifting away from the ways of the slave. And the charge impudence, which could be almost anything as described by Mr. Frederick Douglass, was a justifiable cause for a whipping. Once the Yankees arrived, masters and mistresses detected examples of such behavior almost everywhere in the defection of the favorites, in the demeanor and language of the slaves who remained, in their refusal to submit to punishment, in their failure to obey orders promptly or at all, and most frequently in their unwillingness to work as usual. Now, how could they all of a sudden behave like this? Because the Union soldiers nearby represented the near end of slavery. The enslaved were very informed about what was happening during the war, and they could sense the change in the master's demeanor and the shift of energy in the community once the Yankees arrived. This is how some could refuse punishment, not obey orders, and be unwilling to work. To a Louisiana planter traveling from Ascension Parish to New Orleans in mid-1863, the slaves he observed along the way were nearly all
insolent and idle,
which he defined as
working not more than half a day, yet demanding full rations of everything.
To the wife of a prominent Alabama planter, the slaves behaved in
an insolent manner
by taking off whenever there was work to be done.
The Negroes are worse than free,
she informed her son.
They say they are free. We cannot exert any authority. I beg ours to do what little is to be done.
Negroes weren't trying to hear anything else from her. In their mind, they were free, which meant no more listening to the missus. To a Virginia white woman, the blacks were acting
very independent and impudent.
And like most whites, she equated the two traits. Independence and challenging authority were qualities unbecoming of a slave. For more than 200 years at this point, Negroes were conditioned not to act in that manner, which is why it's shocking for this woman to see them doing it. To slave owners everywhere, the defections were difficult enough to understand, but the ways in which some slaves chose to depart invariably provoked the most grievous charge of all: ingratitude. Few stated it more succinctly than Emily C. Douglass, a resident of Natchez who had earlier extolled the loyalty of her slaves.
They left without even a goodbye,
which from the slaveholders' perspective was a sign of being ungrateful. Now, in their view, they had taken care of the blacks and raised them in a civilized environment, right? They viewed slavery as doing them a favor. So when the Negroes left without saying bye, it was, in her mind, an ungrateful act. The delirium of excitement set off by the arrival of the Yankees gave scores of slaves a much welcomed respite from their usual labors and momentarily paralyzed agricultural operations. That was the day, a former Florida slave remembered, when they dropped their plows and hoes, rushed to their cabins, put on their best clothes, and went into town to join with other slaves in a
joyous and unforgettable occasion.
If the slaves did not stop work altogether, they often slowed down the pace and made only sporadic appearances in the fields,
going, coming, and working when they please and as they please,
sometimes spending the day in their cabins, sometimes venturing into town for a week at a time. The attempts to make a crop under these conditions were futile. On the Magnolia Plantation in Louisiana, the overseer first complained that the slaves were
very slow getting out.
3 weeks later,
the ring of the bell no longer a delightful sound,
and the slaves were
moving very slowly.
More than a month later, in utter exasperation, he could only
wish every Negro would leave the place, as they will do only what pleases them, go out in the morning when it suits them, come in when they please, etc.
Doing whatever they wanted and whenever they wanted to do it, right? This must have been an extremely frustrating time for the owners and overseers who were used to controlling them. The erratic performance of the slaves even dismayed some northern observers, who wondered if this augured trouble for a free labor system. The Negroes' idea of freedom, an alarmed Union reporter observed,
is that of unrestrained license to do as they please and go where they choose.
The idea some Negroes had created about freedom in their world of imagination was a life of doing just as one pleased and whenever they felt like doing it. That's how this Union reporter interpreted their actions. They had traveled from one extreme, slavery, to the extreme opposite of the pole, which is unrestrained and unrestricted freedom. The slaves might well have agreed, after having watched their masters and other whites for so many years interpret freedom in precisely that manner, which is probably what it looked like to the enslaved, like the master could do any and everything they wanted to. Let's continue. To mark their release from bondage, blacks not only withheld their labor, but in some instances vented their frustrations and bitterness on the most glaring and accessible symbols of their past labor: the big house, which they might pillage; the cotton gin, which they might deliberately destroy; the slave pens and cotton houses, which in some cases were converted into freedmen's schools and churches; and the overseer, who often represented the sole authority left on a plantation and who had come to personify the excesses of bondage. Many overseers clearly deserved their reputation for cruelty. Nevertheless, the discipline they enforced, the punishments they meted out, and the labor they exacted from the slaves almost always reflected their need to meet the expectations of their employers, rather than share the responsibility for any excesses that might result from his often inordinate demands. The planter all too readily permitted his overseer to assume the blame. Indeed, the owner might even intercede at times to soften the overseer's punishments, thereby enhancing his own sense of paternalism and humanity, while reinforcing the image of the overseer as an uncaring brute. Neither the slaves nor the overseers were necessarily oblivious to this kind of deception, but the flight of the masters often left the overseer by himself to absorb the slave's wrath. Regardless of what whites remained on the plantation, the coming of the Yankees encouraged slaves to act as though there were alternatives in their lives. If they chose not to desert, they might simply refuse to submit to the usual discipline and punishments. On the C.C. Clay plantation in Alabama, the slaves had become
so bold,
the mistress informed her son, that they threatened to kill the overseer if he tried to punish them for disobedience. Oh, snaps! That these were not empty threats is borne out by what took place on the Mulauden plantation in Louisiana, where
bad feelings
between the overseer and the slaves had prompted the absentee owner to pay a visit to his place. When Mulauden tried to reprimand the ringleader, the slave responded with insolence. Unaccustomed to such conduct, the planter then struck him with a whip. This time the slave responded by furiously charging Mulauden, who finally felled him with a stick. He cracked the slave across his cranium. Then this happened.
This seemed to bring the Negro to his senses, and he took refuge in his cabin, but he presently came out with a hatchet.
Here we goeth. One of the other slaves interceded at this point and grabbed the hatchet. The rebellious slave fled into the cane field, and Mulauden departed from the plantation, thinking he had suppressed
the affair.
So did things cool down after that? Let's see. He had not gone far, however, before the report reached him that his slaves were now
in full revolt
and had killed the overseer. This is wild, isn't it? And there's more. Returning once again to the plantation, this time with Union soldiers, Mulauden beheld an extraordinary scene. A large number of his blacks, with their possessions and quantities of plantation goods, were walking alongside a cart on which lay the body of the murdered overseer, wrapped in a flag. Put the flag over him and everything. Now, how was the overseer killed?
It appears that he had been attacked by 5 of them while he was at dinner, his head being split open by blows with a hatchet and penetrated by shots at his face.
Vicious. The assassins reportedly rejoiced over their success, and the whole gang of some 150 slaves had left the plantation. Anticipating acts of vengeance, some overseers fled shortly before the Yankees reached their plantations. Not surprisingly, the war and emancipation played upon and exacerbated white fears and fantasies that were as old as slavery itself. Despite the apprehensions they voiced, far fewer masters and mistresses were murdered and assaulted than expected to be. So these are exceptional cases here. Most of the Negroes did not have it in them to revolt like this. They weren't conditioned to have this type of temperament. But there were always some who had it regardless. While hiding from the Yankees, Joseph LeConte encountered a fellow South Carolinian who lived from day to day in a state of terror, convinced that a neighbor slave he had once flogged would now murder him.
We tried to reason with him and show him the absurdity of his fears,
LeConte recalled,
but all in vain. He looked upon himself as a doomed man.
Although the planter escaped the anticipated vengeance, the fears he had felt were neither unique nor groundless. Always eager for news from her beloved Charleston, Emma Holmes recoiled at the reported murder of
My old friend,
William Allen,
who was chopped to pieces in his barn.
Still other reports and rumors of murder and assault dominated the conversations of whites, including the ominous story of a planter who
narrowly escaped being murdered by two of his most trusty Negroes.
In a South Carolina community, the Union commander reported that whites were imploring him for protection from the blacks,
who were arming themselves and threatening the lives of their masters,
and one slaveholder had requested protective custody
to save his life.
In nearly all instances of slave violence against their owners, whites tended to blame the Yankees, as did Emma Holmes, for having aroused
the foulest demoniac passions of the Negro, hitherto so peaceful and happy.
It's making the Negroes come out of their normally peaceful and happy character, is how she viewed this. And it's the Yankees' fault for instigating it because the Negroes themselves didn't really want to act that way, right? This is how she understood it back then and was a general understanding by a lot of folks. At least, such explanations preserved whites from what would have otherwise been a most excruciating self-examination. Rather than murder their masters, some slaves preferred to expose them to the humiliations they had once meted out so freely. In Choctaw County, Mississippi, slaves administered several hundred lashes to Nat Best, a local planter. In nearby Madison County, 2 slaves, one of them disguised as a Union soldier, were reported to have mercilessly whipped an elderly white woman. And in Virginia, near Jamestown, the former slaves of a reputedly cruel master whipped him some 20 times to remind him of past punishments. Some people don't want to let it go and turn the other cheek when they have been abused so long. For some people, revenge is the only way that they can get justice. When the Yankees arrived, a former Virginia slave recalled, the mistress on a neighboring plantation was whipping a house girl.
The soldiers made the house girl strip the mistress, whip her, then dress in her clothes. She left with the soldiers.
Young Sarah Morgan reacted with horror rather than skepticism to the reports from Baton Rouge, her hometown, that blacks were stopping ladies on the street, cutting the necklaces from their necks, stripping the rings from their fingers, and subsequently bragging of these feats. That these proved to be exceptional and isolated examples made them no less sensational and ominous. Although most slave owners did not meet personal violence at the hands of their slaves, the persistent reports and rumors of murder, insubordination, insolence, and plunder sustained the threat and the genuine fear that black freedom might degenerate into insurrectionary violence.
We are afraid now to walk outside of the gate,
A South Carolina woman confessed, after hearing that field hands in the immediate vicinity were
in a dreadful state.
This was how it happened, only in selective situations. But it was something that put real fear in the minds of whites. And it had them paranoid because they never knew who could strike next. Of course, people are going to be afraid when they hear about people nearly escaping the death of their 2 most trusted Negroes, right? That could make anyone begin questioning their own stock of Negroes, looking around like who could be the one that's coming after me, right? I want you to think about that. And from here, we go on to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.